Who makes the best laptop CPU in 2025? I've compared the best options from Intel and AMD in 29 games, as well as applications, thermals, battery life, power draw, and way more to find out. Oh, and spoiler, if you care about gaming, AMD's 9955HX3D destroys Intel. Intel's Core Ultra 9 275HX processor has 24 cores, with 8 of them being higher performing P cores and 16 being lower powered E cores. Intel also removed hyperthreading this generation, so the 24 cores have 24 threads. Meanwhile, AMD's Ryzen 9 9955HX3D has 16 cores and 32 threads. So Intel technically has more cores in total, but AMD's are all more similar to Intel's fewer, more powerful P cores. AMD's chip has a whopping 256% more level 3 cache compared to Intel, which gives the 3D a big advantage in games. But Intel has 150% more level 2 cache than AMD. Both processors have a 5.4 GHz max boost clock, but Intel supports faster DDR5 6400 memory at stock, while AMD runs at DDR5 5600. I've used the exact same kit of DDR5 5600 memory in both of these laptops. Yeah, I could have used the fastest 6400 RAM in the Intel laptop, which would still be a fair comparison, as that's just a genuine benefit of Intel's current platform. But my goal here was to focus on the differences between these two processors without other components being a factor. And there are still plenty of Intel 275HX laptops that ship with DDR5 5600 memory. But don't worry, I will compare the RAM differences in a future video. Get subscribed for that. And as for why I'm not using Intel's best 285HX processor, well, it's just not available in that many laptops. And given the only difference compared to the 275HX is that it has a 100 MHz higher single-core boost clock, I can see why laptop makers might not want to further increase the price of their laptops just to have that top-end chip. Trust me, that 100 MHz difference is not going to affect the conclusion of this video. Now, I'm using XMG's Neo 16 laptops to do this testing, as both laptops have the same full-powered RTX 5090 laptop GPU, same drivers, same Windows updates, same game updates, same air cooling, same battery, same everything. So this comparison is as fair as it gets. Both of these laptops allow us to adjust the power limit of the CPU through the Control Center software, and more power equals more performance, but also more heat. This graph shows the Cinebench multi-core score for both processors at different power levels, with AMD in red and Intel in blue. Between 15 and 75 watts of power, Intel was performing better, but then for some reason, Intel performance drops down between 85 and 120 watts. That's quite weird, but I've seen similar results reported by others, though it's often more of a brief plateau than a dip like I saw on my laptop. Anyway, this means AMD is outperforming Intel in this test between 75 and 155 watts of power, despite this test not really caring about AMD's 3D V-cache. The software doesn't let the AMD laptop use more than 160 watts of power, while Intel goes higher, but after monitoring performance in a number of different apps, I found both laptops would thermal throttle around the 155 watt mark. So all applications have been tested at both 80 watts and 150 watts, where 80 watts is meant to represent a lower performance mode, while 150 watts shows max performance you'd likely see from most laptops. Intel was about 6% faster in terms of single-core score, but had a smaller 3% lead in multi-core with both running at 80 watts, and then it was less than 0.5% better at 150 watts. The Intel laptop was also running a little cooler with both at 150 watts, though the gap was bigger in favor of AMD with both running at 80 watts. Granted, Intel was also performing better there. The AMD laptop was drawing more power from the wall than the Intel laptop, whether we're limiting the processors to an 80 or 150 watt TDP. This puts Intel ahead from an efficiency perspective, at least in this multi-core test where the 3D V-cache doesn't assist, though that ends up being the case for most of the non-gaming workloads. Basically, Intel was using less power in this test while outperforming outperforming AMD slightly, so it's more efficient. The AMD chip was reaching higher clock speeds, which I suspect is because the Intel chip has more cores to spread its power over with all those lower powered E-cores. That's just one workload though. Other rendering workloads like Blender, V-Ray, or Corona Renderer were all performing better on AMD, regardless of the power limit set. So these clearly prefer AMD's 16 big cores over Intel's 8 big cores plus 16 small cores. Content creator workloads like Photoshop had a notable benefit with AMD, while the gap in Adobe Premiere was much smaller. Video encoding with Handbrake was a fair bit faster with AMD too, but it's a similar gap to what we saw when I compared the 275HX with the 9955HX non-3D. So AMD is able to win nicely without the extra L3 cache. These results are in seconds rather than a score, so lower is better now. And Intel had a massive lead when it came to MATLAB. This workload doesn't seem to care too much about extra power. But yeah, if you're working with this software a lot, Intel might be the way to go. AES encryption with OpenSSL was significantly better with AMD. But again, we saw similar gaps with the 9955HX compared to the 275HX. So the big gains are not due to the extra L3 cache. AMD was around 39% faster in decompression with 7-zip, and around 18% faster when it came to compression. Compiling LLVM was much faster with AMD, and some of this difference must be due to the extra L3 cache, because AMD was around 46% faster at both power levels here. And when I compared Intel to the non-3D 9955HX, AMD still had a significant but lower 28% lead over Intel. Geekbench claims to test realistic workloads, but unlike Cinebench earlier, AMD was ahead when it came to single-core tests. On average, out of these specific tests, AMD's Ryzen 9 9955HX3D was 16% faster than Intel's Core Ultra 9 275HX, with both power limited to 80 watts. Intel only really had a clear win when it came to MATLAB, but the majority of real-world workloads tested were better on AMD, though the extra L3 cache only seems to help in the compilation test. The gap gets slightly larger in favor of AMD, with both power limited to 150 watts. AMD was 19% faster now, with its biggest wins coming from OpenSSL AES encryption, LLVM compilation, and 7-zip decompression. For reference, the 9955HX was 12% faster than Intel across these same tests. So the 9955HX3D is even further ahead. It's just that in most of these workloads, the extra cache doesn't really matter. AMD is able to win these tests without it. So AMD performs better in a bunch of real-world workloads. But the difference gets way bigger when we look at gaming. I've tested both laptops in 29 games without power limits at 1080p, 1440p, and even 4K resolutions, because spoiler, sometimes the CPU difference actually matters even at 4K, which isn't something we usually see when it comes to CPU comparisons. Baldur's Gate 3 had the biggest win on the 9955HX3D out of all 29 games tested at 1080p and 1440p, reaching a 72% higher average frame rate with AMD at 1080p and 46% higher at 1440p, which is an insane difference considering how close most of the non-gaming workloads were earlier. There's almost no difference in average FPS at 4K, as we're more GPU bound there, but AMD was still able to get us a 12% higher 1% low, which means CPU selection is still affecting gaming performance at 4K, something we don't normally see in most CPU comparisons. Fortnite was tested at low settings, and had some pretty big gains with AMD's extra cache too, reaching a 36% higher average frame rate at 1080p, 40% higher at 1440p, and 28% higher at 4K. This was the biggest gain for AMD's 3D chip at 4K out of all 29 games tested. So yeah, some games, depending on the settings, can see big improvements at 4K with the right processor. PUBG also had above average gains with the 9955HX3D, reaching a 45% higher average FPS at 1080p, a smaller but still substantial 23% lead at 1440p, and and then only a 3% gain at 4K. The difference in 1% lows is bigger than the difference in average FPS, which just means the 3D is more stable and consistent. Hogwarts Legacy, on the other hand, didn't really see any major differences when it came to the 1% lows, but AMD's 3D chip still provided a 32% boost to average FPS at 1080p, a 10% improvement at 1440p, and then basically no real difference at 4K in terms of average FPS, though the gap in 1% lows was bigger here. Of course, not every game saw big gains with the 9955HX3D. Performance was basically identical on both laptops in Dying Light 2. Granted, I tested at high settings. Maybe it'd be a different story with lower settings, but I don't think there's much point when 4K still sustains 60 FPS without even making use of upscaling. Microsoft Flight Simulator also didn't see any differences at 4K or 1440p, and 1080p was only 4% ahead on AMD in average FPS, though there was a bigger 15% boost to 1% lows with the 3D. Counter-Strike 2 was another big win for our three-dimensional processor, reaching a 29% higher average FPS at 1080p and 32% better at 1440p, the third largest difference at this resolution out of all 29 games tested. Even 4K gets some benefit from the extra cache, and this game was actually a win for Intel when I compared their 275HX against AMD's 9955HX. So it's crazy how much things turn around for AMD simply by utilizing the third dimension. The Riftbreaker was included as a real-time strategy game, and with the CPU benchmark, AMD was always performing better, with a 40% higher average frame rate at 1080p, but perhaps more importantly, a 64% higher 1% low, the biggest difference seen in 1% lows out of all 29 games tested. Again, that just means the AMD laptop is going to run the game smoother. Civ 6 turn time was tested with the game's AI benchmark, so we're looking at how long it takes a turn to complete here rather than FPS, which means lower numbers are better. The resolution also doesn't matter for this test, and this was one of the few games where Intel was slightly better than AMD, as apparently AMD's extra L3 cache doesn't matter in this workload. Instead of individually talking through the rest of the 20 games tested, I'll just quickly skip through the results on screen now, as for the most part, many of them have smaller differences than what we've already looked at, so feel free to pause the video if you want a closer look at any of the other games tested. I think it's important to test a wide selection of games so that we can get an accurate picture of the average performance differences to make the fairest possible conclusion. In other words, more data equals more better. Let's look at those average differences next. On average, over all 29 games tested, at 1080p, AMD's Ryzen 9 9955HX3D was 16% faster when compared to Intel's Core Ultra 9 275HX. Some games like Baldur's Gate saw massive improvements with AMD's extra L3 cache, and 17 of the games tested had a 10% or greater boost to average FPS with AMD. But what about 1% low results? These show the dips in performance and represent how stable gameplay is. And on average, the difference was fairly similar, with AMD 17% ahead of Intel. If you saw my comparison between Intel and AMD without the L3 cache, the difference here was basically nothing on average. So yeah, AMD's extra cache is providing a much more stable experience than Intel, stepping up to 1440p, and the 9955HX3D was now 8% faster than the 275HX in average FPS. Considering most gaming laptops that ship with either of these processors will have 1440p screens with a GPU that can run games at 1440p, this comparison is the most realistic. Ultimately, 18 of the 25 games tested were 5% or less faster on AMD, but the games that do benefit from AMD's extra cache benefit in a big way. There's a slightly higher 10% benefit to the 1% lows with AMD, and honestly, I think these improvements are more important than the average frame rates, as they show how much more consistent and stable the performance is on the AMD laptop in the majority of games tested. If you're connecting a 4K monitor, AMD still had a 2% lead over Intel in terms of average FPS, and a 5% lead when it comes to the 1% lows. That doesn't sound like much, but it's actually a pretty big difference for a CPU comparison. Most of the time, there's basically basically no difference between top-end processors when it comes to gaming at 4K, as the GPU matters more. But even at 4K here, some games still see significant improvements with the 9955HX3D. Here's how frame rates look if we instead take the average of all games at all resolutions. I think this better allows us to visually see the overall difference in a quick and easy summary. This sort of performance boost we're seeing with AMD at 1440p is more in line with a higher tier GPU. CPU comparisons normally just don't see this sort of an improvement, so in a way, it's kinda like turning the 5090 laptop GPU into a 5090 Ti. Intel had a big win when it came to performance on the integrated graphics, reaching more than double the average FPS compared to AMD in Cyberpunk 2077 at 720p medium settings. AMD does have better integrated graphics options in their other processors, just not in their higher end HX stuff, which I think makes sense as you'd only pair these processors with powerful discrete graphics. Nevertheless, if for some reason you do care about iGPU gaming, Intel wins massively here. Intel's superior integrated graphics gave it significantly better runtime when it came to battery life. Now, to be fair, this comparison is not perfectly fair, because my AMD laptop had a mini LED screen, while the Intel laptop had an IPS panel, and there would be some power difference due to that, despite them both running at the same brightness level. Regardless, I can say for sure that the gap in battery life is huge, because the 9955HX I tested did have the same screen as the Intel laptop, and the Intel machine still lasted way longer. Performance while running on battery power was also better with Intel when running both laptops in the highest mode allowed on battery. So if you need runtime or performance on battery, you'll have to decide if it's worth missing out on the gaming gains we saw earlier to go with Intel. So what sort of a price difference are we talking about between Intel and AMD? Prices will of course change over time, so check the links below the video for updates and to see if there are any current sales. Because if gaming laptops with either of these processors do have a good sale, we'll add them to the GamingLaptop.deals website. We update that every day to include all the best sales. So make sure that you check it out regularly to save money on your next gaming laptop with that link below. At the time of recording in mid-August, the same laptop with the same specs I've tested in the US from electronics goes for $3,895 while the 9955HX3D version costs an extra $100. Or just 2.5% more money. Despite costing more, AMD offers better value from a cost per frame perspective in games. Yeah, you've got to spend an extra $100 more to get the 9955HX3D, but it's well worth it relative to the extra performance improvements in games at all three resolutions tested. The price gap is a bit bigger over in Germany, where my XMG laptops come from, with the 9955HX3D setting you back an extra €165. But the cost per frame results are still similar here too, with a win for AMD despite the price difference being bigger here. Intel just needs to cost even less to be competitive. Not only was AMD significantly faster in gaming thanks to that third dimension of cache, but AMD performed a fair bit better in most of the real-world CPU workloads too, though those differences aren't so much a result of the extra cache, as even AMD's 9955HX without the 3D still beats Intel in most of those. If you're after the best performance possible in a gaming laptop, honestly, you'd be crazy not to spend the extra $200 or so to get the 9955HX3D. Man, that is a long name. I'd only go for Intel if there's a specific app you use that has a benefit there, like MATLAB, or if you care about integrated graphics performance, or if you want much better battery life and better performance while running on battery power. And those things are definitely important in devices that are designed to be portable. But for me, given I use my laptop plugged in most of the time anyway, I'd just take the better performance with AMD. Unfortunately, AMD's 9955HX3D isn't actually available in all that many laptops. Intel's 275HX is way more common, so if there's a specific model of laptop you want to buy that's Intel only, you'll have to decide if the features that it offers are more important than the performance boost you'd get from AMD. Ultimately, you can't go too wrong with either CPU. At the end of the day, they both still perform well in games, but I can't deny that the 9955HX3D takes things to the next level, and it's unfortunate that some brands like Asus are only offering the AMD processors with lower tier graphics, like the the Asus Strix G16. If you want it with an AMD processor, then it maxes out with RTX 5070 Ti graphics. You're forced into buying the Intel model if you want the 5080 or 5090. I don't like it. And GPU selection will usually make a bigger difference in games compared to the CPU difference. So check this one out next to find out if the 5090s I've tested are worth the extra cash. You might be better off saving some money and going for the 5080 instead. So I'll see you in that one next to find out.